Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. Australia is professed to be the most successful multicultural society in the world. However, with our treatment of multicultural communities throughout the pandemic, a selective immigration process, and fraught ongoing Indigenous relations, Australia continues to deliver some sharp lessons about race. Why is it that some lives are remembered, commemorated and valued more than others? Delivered in the wake of the Queen's passing, author and activist Sisonke Msimang explores the preciousness of white life in the precarious face of black lives. This is the FODI 2022 session, Precious White Lives.
Thank you so much, Stan. And hi, everybody. I feel like that introduction is pretty impressive. Lower your expectations. I too wish to acknowledge the land on which we meet. I want to say in my own language, Sanibonani, Sianihlonipa, which means we pay respect to the elders of this nation. Increasingly, I like to do my welcomes in my own language because I think our ancestors and our elders speak to one another. They understand each other easier when we don't need to use English. So this lecture does fall at a really interesting time, a very illustrative time in terms of a singular, very, very, very precious, the most precious white life on the planet has just ended. In many ways, this lecture began many, many years ago. It's the culmination of thinking and living and being a non-Indigenous Black person here in this society. I began writing it in my head when I got here 8 years ago as a new migrant. Within just weeks of my arrival, I had some excellent material for a talk on race and otherness. It had hardly been a month, and I was walking alone at a shopping center, taking a break from my children, when a white woman in her 40s or 50s, passing me by, we were doing this, reached out to touch my hair. Complete stranger. I pulled away, shocked, and she looked shocked too. We didn't speak. I suspect that she was shocked at my recoil and my fear. And I wondered in that moment how I would live here, in a place where I was such a curiosity that a perfect stranger would try to touch me. So firstly, we all know enough about race to understand that that opposite scenario would never have been possible, right? A Black person could never reach out and touch a random person anywhere, let alone their hair, without it being perceived as a threat or some form of mental illness. It's a ridiculous idea because the logics of race don't work that way. And we all understand the logics of race that make the opposite scenario impossible to happen. So of course, the only way to make sense out of that very odd encounter is to understand it through a racial lens. So what was important in that moment is that I was a curiosity, an exotic other, and her reaching out to touch me reminded me that I did not belong here. Even though it was 2015, the White Australia policy was over, and the country professed to be the most successful multicultural society in the world. And it didn't matter, historically speaking, that she also didn't belong here, that nobody asked the consent of Indigenous people across this land for any of us to be here. In this society that has been built since settlement, her hair, her skin, and everything about her body is seen as belonging to Australia. And so her attempt to touch me was deeply embedded in the sense that she was normal and I was not. She wanted to touch my difference, yeah? It wasn't just my hair she wanted to touch. It was me. She thought that my hair betrayed something of the essence of me. Biological thinking. It happened really fast, so I couldn't tell her what I hope we all know in this room, which is that race is a myth invented by Europeans to justify their sense of superiority, enforced over time, to justify slavery and colonization, all the things we know, right? But that race has absolutely no basis in biological fact. There is more genetic variation within so-called race groups than there is across race groups, yeah? So I probably have more in common genetically with members of this audience who may have ancestry from Sweden than I do with someone from West Africa, for example, yeah? And of course, ultimately, the differences between us are literally only skin deep. More than any other mammal, humans have this extraordinary degree of genetic sameness because of our homogeneous roots, because we can trace our earliest beginnings to a common ancestor. But the woman who tried to touch me wasn't interested in any of these thoughts on race. She was simply fascinated. And she felt that she had the right to express that racial fascination without my input and without my consent. And so that fascination is part of what I want us to explore today. Over the years, there have, of course, been many other incidents, too many to list, to be honest. And after a while, it felt like a bit of a waste of time to keep track of them all. And of course, having lived and worked most of my life in various African countries and in America, by the time I got to Australia, my sense of self-worth was already very fine. So I met these everyday slights with more curiosity and humor than hurt. Then, in 2020, when the pandemic hit and the Black Lives Matter movement began to dominate our lives, I picked up the thread again, taking copious notes in my head, keeping a log of observations about whiteness. Because it seemed to me that Australia did have a very significant problem with unreconstructed whiteness. A definitional note so that I'm not accused of generalizing. So that's the definition, that's the working definition we're using for whiteness, yeah? It refers to the way people constructed as white and their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. So whiteness normalizes white racial identity, and it results in a culture in which non-white people are seen as inferior or abnormal. So we are the ones who carry race, and white people are neutral. Yeah, they're the norm. So that's why I'm the one being reached out to be touched, and why I could never imagine doing the same thing, because she's normal and I'm not. Yeah? In 2020, racism felt raw to me for the first time in a really long time. Mark McGowan, known as State Daddy, to those of us in WA. He closed the borders, and he declared that Western Australia would become an island within an island. So he literally said those words. At first, it was absolutely glorious to be inside Fortress WA. Having grown up in mainly poor countries, I had never, ever in my life been the target of such generous policies designed to keep me safe and healthy and happy. It was wow. So I would stroll, through the park near my house, frolic on the beach with my kids. I felt like the world was hugging me. I thought, wow, this is what white privilege feels like. It's amazing. Thank you, State Daddy. But of course, the feeling was short-lived. Within weeks of the border closure, Rio Tinto blew up a sacred site in the Pilbara. Juukan Gorge was blown up in the interests of mining. And it provided a stark reminder that I could frolic all I wanted. The state's response to COVID and my personal feelings of security would not alter the underlying inequalities that had for so long defined the place in which I was living. So Juukan was destroyed on May 24th, 46,000 years. And the next day, on the 25th of May 2020, George Floyd was murdered on a street in Minneapolis that I had walked on many, many times as a university student because I went to college in the Twin Cities. So the two events happened worlds away from one another, but they jolted me out of the bubble of complacency that I was beginning to feel in WA. Having lived in both places, having experienced the specifics of racism in Australia and in America, I felt strangely connected to this moment via both the local and the global. I was not alone, of course. For Indigenous and Black people, for migrants, especially those from poor countries, the pandemic and the racial justice protests that played out alongside it felt like a matter of life and death. South Africa, where I'm from, people were dying, and by the middle of 2020, I was logging into Zoom funerals and online vigils more often than I care to talk about. In America, where so many of my friends still live, more videos emerged of anti-Black police brutality. In Australia, as deaths in custody continued apace, and the mandatory coronial inquests that follow those deaths played out on the news, it was really hard to ignore the words of Alison Whitaker, a Gomeroi poet and legal researcher, who wrote that, quote, "For many of those who had lost their loved ones in custody, the inquests were a site of fresh administrative violence." So each time another set of violences is unleashed, a new remembering, which is in many ways what Stan was speaking to in his introductory remarks about what happens when we mourn the Queen, that we are being reminded constantly it's a fresh violence that is being enacted. If 2020 had a mood, it was ominous. And I took the violence very personal for obvious reasons. And I took the illness that COVID represented very personally because it was claiming the lives of people I loved, whom I could not go and see and farewell. And I had already lived through one pandemic, AIDS, and here was another, again, claiming my generation. So those of us who weren't claimed by AIDS, COVID got us. And so when Australia announced that this country would buy 3 times more vaccine doses than we needed, I wanted to weep. The preciousness of Australian life. Everywhere I looked, globally and within this country, it seemed that decisions were being made that entrenched the idea that white lives were precious, and more than that Black lives were not. Understandably, public conversations about racism were all about Black pain and suffering. And like many, many Black people I know, I was not interested in viewing endless footage of violence enacted against us. It seemed to me that it might be more useful to turn the spotlight onto white people, to think about whiteness. I could see the value, of course, of talking about Black lives, but I really was interested, especially living in WA, in focusing on white lifestyles. I kept coming back to the need to tackle the original sin of race, to remind people that race is an invention, a fiction that has helped to shape how white people see themselves as precious, worth protecting and defending always. And I wanted to focus on the invisible histories that have convinced white people that, in the words of Black British critic Paul Gilroy, in the way that modern racism works, blackness is the body and whiteness is the mind. In the way that, I've said it twice. Okay, I'll say it again. Here we go, in case you didn't hear it. In the way that modern racism works, blackness is the body and whiteness is the mind. You know the way those Manichaean pairings, those dualistic couples are organized, yeah? So whiteness needs blackness in order to have meaning. You can't be superior if there's no inferior, yeah? So we need one another for this whole thing to work. You can trace the invention of race back to the 1500s, when European explorers began to come into contact with various people in Africa, Asia, and America who were always there and therefore needed no discovering. By the 1800s, racial thinking was becoming a science, and one that dovetailed very neatly with the practices of slavery and colonization. How convenient. There was a boom in journals established to study the differences between the races. For example, a journal called Negromania, what a great title for a journal, insisted that never at any given time, from the most infinitely remote antiquity until now, has there ever appeared a race of Negroes, that is, men with woolly heads, flat noses, thick and protruding lips, who has ever emerged from a state of savagism or barbarism to even a demi-civilization. Look to the West Indies, to Brazil, to Australia. Yeah, so we are all tarred with the same brush of savagism. And in Australia, this sort of theorizing was accompanied by what I call violent science. Colonial doctors robbed the graves of Aboriginal people and sent their remains to England in pursuit of research, that same England whose queen we are now mourning. And men like Baldwin Spencer, Australia's most eminent evolutionary anthropologist, compared Aboriginal people with other, quote, crude and quaint creatures of this continent, including the kangaroo and the platypus. Baldwin claimed, in the language of the time, that Aborigines were a doomed race, a throwback species that, like its animal equivalents, would soon become extinct. So the idea at the time was that actually platypus could not live, it could not continue to live. It had been cut off from the rest of animals. What a strange creature. It could not continue to live. And since Aboriginal people were like the flora and fauna, they too were a doomed species. And this informs so much of policy thinking that developed in a racialized way across this country, this notion of the doomed species. As a society was built in the image of the new settlers, racial thinking crystallized. And so I want to explore two arenas in which we can see how whiteness took a hold of the identities of settlers. Two areas, sport and medicine. There's footy matches on today, aren't there? Two of them. So let's begin with sport. Because on the sports field, human bodies are on display and we can look at them unabashedly, make comment upon them as they strive and compete against one another. So the first example is from a boxing match that happened a few kilometers away from where we are today, at Sydney Stadium in Rushcutter Bay, on Boxing Day in 1908. Thousands of people gathered, 26,000 people actually, gathered to watch a white man and a black man box. The photos are phenomenal. That's the crowd that gathered on that day. People are jammed against one another as far as the eye can see. The white man who was fighting was world heavyweight champion Tommy Burns, a Canadian, and he was facing off against Jack Johnson, a Black American man who holds the Negro title for boxing. Are people familiar with this fight? Ah, good. Enough of you don't know the story that it's going to be new. So Burns was actually, that's a good shot, because apparently he was pretty small for a heavyweight fighter. He was about 5'7", and he wasn't very talented. There are rumors that the world title was given to him as a gift by Jim Jeffries, who had been the former heavyweight. Just gave it to him, gave him the belt. Like most other sports of the time, boxing is segregated, but Jack Johnson, Burns' opponent, is a barrier-breaking athlete, and he refuses to be held back by the color bar. So he's chased Burns by this time across 3 continents, begging him for a fight, right? Because Jack Johnson is the Negro heavyweight, and he wants to be the world heavyweight. So he keeps asking this guy for a fight, and the guy is moving from place to place, fighting only white people, and refusing to fight him because he's looking at him, and he's like, and he says, no, I'm not going to break the color line. I'm not going to break the color bar. I'm not fighting you on principle. And then a flamboyant Sydney-sider named Hugh McIntosh offers to pay him the exorbitant sum of 6,000 pounds, which was a lot of money. And so Burns finally agrees. So his principles caved when the money was good enough. And so on the day of the match, the crowd ignores Johnson's obvious physical advantages, and they are firmly in favor of this white guy. Their loyalty is purely racial, supported by pages and pages of scientific theory that prove Black inferiority. The crowd is convinced that Johnson will be defeated. So you can look at the 2 human beings and see who's likely to win this match. But racial thinking and science has absolutely convinced them, not just 1 or 2, the whole 26,000, those people are all convinced that Jack Johnson is going to lose, because science tells them that white people are superior and Black people on this continent are a doomed race, right? They're frail. Okay, predictably, Johnson wins. And the crowd is furious. The police have to be called to calm the situation down. And they insist that Johnson didn't win, that he cheated. It is very hard to imagine it today, but the loss was historic. There's a fantastic Ken Burns documentary about Jack Johnson that's worth seeing. So the loss is historic. It was considered a basic biological fact that Black people were inferior to whites. It was unimaginable what had just happened. The saga did not end in Sydney. 2 years later, Johnson fights Jim Jeffries, the guy who gave Tom Burns the belt. So they say, you have to have a rematch. But the rematch was with a different white person. Such is the power of racial thinking, that it's a rematch against a different white person. Okay. Again, Johnson prevails. And again, this time the match happens in Reno, Nevada, in America. And again, there's violence. This time, 6 Black people are killed in riots that happen across the United States. "50 cities in America rioted in the wake of the results of the Johnson-Jeffries fight." You can Google it there on Wikipedia, Johnson-Jeffries riots, as white people took their rage out on Black communities. So like the Australians who had booed Johnson in Sydney, the Americans who rioted in the wake of his second win against a white man were of the view that a white man was far too precious to be pummeled by Black fists. In both countries, the crowds were watching because they wanted to believe that white people were more precious, more special, superior. And in the aftermath of the fight, white people, the men who went to those matches, the scientists and the bureaucrats who in Australia were administering the White Australia policy. They could have chosen that moment to accept reality, to say, hang on a minute, the science is not panning out. But instead, they chose to cling to their flimsy notions of whiteness, to believe that their value was contingent on the devaluation of Black life. And in the decades that followed in America and in Australia, in South Africa, where I'm from, and everywhere else in the world where global whiteness exists, there have been massive changes to racial thinking. For one thing, if you ask most people today if there are biological differences between people of different races, they will probably say no. We hope they will say no. And certainly, the once ubiquitous belief that white people were better physical specimens, that Aryan Nazi notion, that no longer exists. In fact, this idea that white people were better in all domains, including the physical, has been replaced by the notion that Black people are stronger, that genetically we're more robust, right? Physically superior to white people. Look at the evidence around us. Indigenous players make up 11% of the AFL. Look at the NBA. The best man. I'm having a moment. Adam Goods. Michael Jordan. Serena. Clearly, Black people, no matter their geographic origins, are better athletes than white people. It's genetic, right? Is it genetic? Genetic. I'm seeing some confusion. Of course it's not. The story of Black people dominating sport, and we do dominate, so we dominate, that's not in question. The question is why. It has nothing to do with genetics. Black people do better at the sports in which we compete in large numbers because we have so few other viable options. Black people do better because in Western societies, our excellence in sport is actually a sign of resilience and creativity, not genetic difference. A Black kid with a ball is encouraged to run. A Black child with a pen is told that she is stupid. And while some Black people might feel flattered to be portrayed as uber athletic, the idea underneath the perception that Black people are better at sport is pernicious. It's deeply tied to the Gilroy comment that I put up earlier. I liked it so much I repeated it. Blackness is the body, whiteness is the mind. Black players are applauded for their strength, for their speed, for their athleticism, but they are rarely commended for their leadership skills, their on-court intelligence. If you listen to sports commentary, Black players are fetishized, made into demigods of superhuman strength, and of course, being superhuman is not quite the same as being human. It's the opposite, in fact. Black athletes occupy a unique place in the popular culture. They are hyper-visible, hyper-strong, hyper-Black. And as Adam Goods found out, Black athletes who don't conform to social expectations, who are seen as threatening to white notions of specialness, like little girls in a stadium, Black athletes who have the audacity to call out racism in very specific terms, when it happens, they become hyper-threats. These ideas about Black physicality have real-life consequences for everyday Black people, and they aren't positive. American studies show that many doctors believe that black people have a higher pain threshold. And as a result, black patients in America are half as likely as white patients to receive pain medicine when they need it. These ideas of black superstrength are throwbacks to scientific racism, to bogus studies from the 1800s that claim that, quote, black skin is thicker and made up of fewer nerve endings than white skin. So that's an old idea that continues to live today and have real life consequences. These ideas have a very long afterlife, and in Australia, countless deaths in custody play themselves out when Aboriginal people die in cells, begging for medical attention. How many times have we heard this story? In pain that goes ignored by police who are in the front, not coming when they are being called for help, or by wardens who don't listen and don't take black pain seriously. So let's come back to Sydney. Fast forward a few decades to an Indigenous athlete who many people saw as superhuman and who certainly carried the joys and burdens of a nation's hope on her shoulders. 90 years after the Johnson fight, in the same city, here where we are, 110,000 people crowded into the Olympic Stadium to watch the opening ceremony. And that night, Kathy Freeman appeared on the stage, dressed in white, like a vision from the future. The identity of the Olympian who would light the cauldron was a tightly guarded secret. Some of you are too young to remember this. And when Freeman was revealed as the one who would light, she was the last in a lineup of all female athletes who carried the torch, and the crowd went wild. The Olympic Games opening ceremony was scripted to project Australia as a nation that had reconciled itself with its history. It was real propaganda. Fantastic, like propaganda has its place, right? It was quite a show, but yeah. It was an epic act of myth-making, a set piece involving 12,000 performers. And at the center of it all was a 13-year-old Nikki Webster, playing the part of the hero girl. That was what she was called in the script, yeah? Her name in the script of the opening ceremonies was Hero Girl. Yeah. Someone said, really? Yeah. And she was meant to embody Australia as a nation, the innocence of a young nation. She walked hand in hand with Jakapura Munyarun, the esteemed Yolngu Songman, in a symbolic act that was meant to convey the idea that Australia, the white girl, had reconciled with her past, as embodied by the black man. Webster stole the nation's heart, and the narrative was the narrative was created of a country that was looking for symbolic peace, even if, in reality, justice was very far out of reach. The mention of Webster's name for many people is deeply nostalgic. When I ran my talk past a few colleagues in WA, as soon as I said her name, people started to smile. But of course, even at the time, there were people who weren't entirely convinced by the narrative. In an article reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the Sydney Olympics, Oliver Murray, the deputy editor of news.com.au, recalled being at an 18th birthday party on the opening night of the Games. On the opening night of the Games. A TV had been pulled out into the party area so that everyone could watch. And Murray recalls, quote, that when a young Nikki Webster entered the ceremony surrounded by Aboriginal dancers, a partygoer who would have been about 17 or 18 yelled out that Nikki Webster wasn't safe with so many Aboriginal men around her. And then, when Kathy Freeman stepped forward and was revealed as the lighter of the cauldron, the partygoers began to boo, end quotes. It is not, of course, coincidental that the joke Murray's young friend made was about Webster's safety, about keeping her precious whiteness intact. Reading Murray's story of what was happening in the real world, even as a myth was being shaped on television, is instructive. It reminds us of how difficult the politics of that moment were, and it reminds us of the everydayness of racism and white preciousness in this country. It forces us to remember that as a Kuku Yalangi and Palm Island woman, Freeman wasn't just racing in the Olympics. She was running against John Howard refusing to offer compensation to Stolen Generations victims. She was running against John Herron, Howard's non-Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Affairs, insisting that government policy on child separations across the decades, including the removal of Freeman's own grandmother, had had an essentially benign intent. In other words, Freeman was running against a set of fictions about what it means to be Black in Australia, and so her victory and her insistence on holding the Aboriginal flag high, even though she had been warned that doing so might result in her being stripped of her medals, is all the more brave and all the more profound. Freeman was not running alone, of course. Howard was on the wrong side of history. He continues to be on the wrong side of history. He is another person I do not understand why is given so much airtime. Many non-Indigenous people were beginning to understand this. On the back of Mabo and the harrowing testimony that was in that Bringing Them Home report, which if anyone has not read, you need to read. It is a matter of national urgency that people in this country read that report. On the back of all of that, before the Olympics, 250,000 people marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, demanding justice. Despite this activism and the powerful moments of pride and wonder Freeman created at the Games, it took 8 years for Indigenous people to be given the apology for the Stolen Generations that was so long overdue. And the bigger apology for invasion, for colonization, for massacres, and for the ongoing abuse and violence against Aboriginal people, that has not yet been offered, nor has there been a treaty which might pave the way for reparations and a genuine path for healing. We are talking now of the voice. Alfred Deakin, Australia's second Prime Minister, was a great proponent of the White Australia policy. And in his election speech in 1903, he said that he was fully committed to the preservation of the complexion of the people of this country and to the multiplying of white homes so that we may be able to occupy, use, and defend every part of our continent. For Deakin, a key government priority was the maintenance of conditions of life fit for white men and white women. This was a big priority. In Sydney last year, I'm winding up. In Sydney last year, when we began to hear about LGAs of concern, it was no surprise to any of us that these were communities of color and that they were under heavy police guard. They were treated as though they posed a threat to the conditions of life fit for white men and women living in the city's more affluent suburbs. It was clear that the precious lives that were being protected weren't those of the migrants in those communities who were providing essential services that richer white Aussies don't want to do, like working in aged care and at checkout counters at grocery stores, which is why COVID was affecting those communities more. These communities were highly vulnerable to infection because of the roles they play in facilitating white comfort. But it was the lives and the lifestyles of the people on Bondi Beach that were deemed more precious. The police were very slow to make those guys get back inside the house. To be clear, the pandemic response was generally pretty remarkable, a testament to politicians and community members who followed the science and trusted health and medical professionals to do their jobs. And for the most part, that trust was well-deserved. But of course, there were these moments in which Australia's leaders seemed to be led by old science, by the faulty premises of racial thinking. And in these moments, what surged forward and made itself apparent was an institutional preoccupation with protecting white people and white lives. This week, as people in the UK have mourned the death of their queen, she is not my queen, and as Australia has fallen in line with the royal protocols, as the ABC, who we have to wonder, who is the ABC for? As the ABC has had this constant hagiographic coverage of the Queen's procession and the strange hats and all of this British custom, I have been struck by how much this country still sees itself as a colony in spite of everything. And this colonial mentality is bad for everybody. It's bad for Black people, for Indigenous people in the first instance, of course, but for all of us who are tarred with the brush of Blackness. We're worst affected. But the trap of whiteness is terrible for white people too. How can a society that sees itself as a nation full of battling, irreverent, fair-minded people agree to be ruled, even if only symbolically, by a king in another country, a leader by inheritance? It makes no sense. It simply cannot be. There has been a lot of pomp and circumstance this week, and many questions about whether we can separate the Queen as a person from the institution she symbolized. And my answer is obviously no, we can't. But I will let Marsha Langston do the talking. Because she says to us, the most difficult relationship is not between Black people and white people in this country. It is between white Australians and the symbols created by their predecessor. And there is no more significant symbol created by white Australia's predecessors than the Queen. Most Australians don't know how to relate to Aboriginal people. They relate to stories told by former colonists, right? So we're not relating to people, we're relating to these ideas, these stories. As Australia goes into a day of national mourning for the Queen of England, I never call her the Queen, because I also have a king, right? My king of the Zulus, nobody calls him the king. When people talk about the king, they're talking about Charles, but I have my own king. So also there's this kind of monolithic sense of who has kings and queens. We have kings and queens. So as Australia goes into a day of national mourning for the Queen of England this week, we have a remarkable opportunity to change our symbols, to craft a society that swears allegiance proudly to the center of this continent, rather than to a monarch in England, to look to Uluru as the symbol of who we want to be, to turn our backs on Australia's history of white specialness and insist on, instead on a future in which all of our lives are precious. I thank you.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.